Thank you very much all for attending this. We are in the last section as mentioned. If it's correct, you see a picture now saying dead hens don't lay eggs. Well, that is a common fact. This is what we're going to talk about. Why do these hens die? Let's have a look at that point. Okay, this again, as it should be, is me, married, still married since Wednesday, 3 children, veterinary service in your area, contact governments, etc. Also with your government. Why do hens die? We can split that up into more or less infectious and non-infectious metabolic disorders. If we look at what is that mortality, what is a normal standard? There is quite a big variation within companies and areas, but the average should be not more than 0.2% a week. In the first 4 weeks, from 20 to 24, you should be far below 0.2. In the period after that, coming into lay, we see a bit higher mortality, over 0.2%, it's more 0.3. And then between 32 and 52, it stays between 0.2, it could be a bit lower. And from 52 till depletion, it is a bit higher. The total gives you a mortality as an average of around 8%. If we take the average age of mortality in the production hen, which is around 40 weeks, we go from 175 eggs, you will miss 95 eggs on each bird which dies as an average. And per percent mortality, you miss 0.54% production, so which is a lot. That will be clear for you in the next slide. And per 40-week hen, you lose 95 eggs. Prices are here calculated on European standards. You lose 95 eggs, and the meat, of course. The cost of that is around 13 euros. There's a bit variation in that, but around 13 euros per dead hen. So it's worthwhile looking at it, especially when you realize it. From June 2019 till June 2020, the average cob mortality was 8.3%, calculating from 24 till 60 weeks. In competition, it was 9.8%. But here it comes. The differences in between areas are enormous. So we have clients who reach a mortality in that period of 3.3%, and we reach clients which reach almost 15% mortality. So only based on the mortality, you lose more than 6% production. That is a lot. Mortality to cull ratio is almost constant in all areas, and it's 6:4. So when you have 10 dead birds, 6 are dead and 4 are culled because of several reasons. When we look at the post-mortem results, why do they die? And we do necropsy on them, like Dr. Clark has just demonstrated to you. You see here a list of findings, and there are 3 red ones, which is the egg peritonitis, the ovary regression, skin injuries. They jump out as most found reasons of mortality. As mentioned, infectious versus non-infectious, and infectious are then parasites, bacteria, viruses. Non-infectious, you talk about management, feed, water. There is one special group which is called prions, and this is a protein which can multiply itself into the body and causes all kind of toxic effects. It's seldom. It's just almost nothing. Only when you give the oil of your car to your chickens, then we find this. So in the parasites, the biggest group is the coccidiosis group. The worms, the nematode and cystoda, not really cause a direct mortality with culling. From the bacterial side, we see Pasteurella, Salmonella, Haemophilus, Mycoplasma, Staphylococcus, Clostridia, E. coli as a real big event, a real big group. From the viruses, we have infectious bronchitis, Newcastle, avian influenza, Marek, avian leukosis virus, which we don't see anymore. And from time to time, we have an ILT issue in a given area. Management-wise, we talk about egg peritonitis, then you talk about weight, age, light, nest, picking, aggression, all those things which are addressed by Paul Welton. You talk about prolapses, so prolapse, a real prolapse, true prolapse, here, picking of birds, feed composition, we talk about sudden death syndrome, tetany, fatty liver syndrome, those are the things we find. Culling due to ovary regression. So this is what we see in the beginning. These flocks have issues with uniformity. The birds come into production, but then stop again and they don't stay in production. So you get a regression of those ovaries. And water can be a source of mortality. There can be certain pathogens in the water, and I think the most known is egg drop syndrome. The availability of water is an issue. Gout. This is something we see in the males, mainly in the males, especially when males and females are transferred to the production, from rearing to production. We can easily find some gout in the males. The males have problems finding the water. Taking a few diseases step by step. Coccidiosis. There are 6 subtypes, no cross protection. In rearing, we find them all, and in production, we find mainly Emeria necatrix. So this is the killer, and the necatrix is often combined with the necrotic enterite. This is the real sudden killer. Most commonly find this somewhere between 22 to 24 weeks. In rearing, I have to say that the most common finding is Emeria tenella, so that's blood in the ceca. What do we do to prevent this? It's the correct use of anticoccidials. That program, the rotation and shuttle programs are not used that much anymore. From time to time, in the middle of Africa, where vaccines are not easily available, we have to use these anticoccidial programs. They work, but you have to be on top of it. And then we have the vaccines. Paracox, Coccivac, Levacox, there's a complete range of vaccines. And the application method, hatchery, feed, by spray, by drinking water, by eye drop. This is done a lot in Brazil. It's an effective method. Unfortunately, the vaccine is not available for us. And in ovo, so in the egg, this is coming up, but not yet successful. What are the critical points? Well, you have to choose the moment of vaccination. So you have to vaccinate somewhere between day 0 and day 9. The amount of litter you use and the litter turning, this is something which you have to keep in mind. Especially the litter, when you use a lot of litter, you get an enormous dilution of the manure which the bird is shedding out. Paper removal is an issue. When do you do that? If you put the birds on paper, or a big pile of paper, and the birds make droppings on the paper, and you remove that paper after the vaccination, then you remove also the oocyst. Why is this important? Because there must be a reshedding. Come back to that later. Increasing a brooding area, how are you going to do that? In principle here, what you have to do if you increase your brooding area is to transport manure, let's call it litter, from the dirty area to the clean area. And that should be at least 1/3 of that issue. In some areas, we have so much problems with this vaccination and these brooding areas, and it is so dry that we even have to wet the litter to get that sporulation of eggs done. The humidity of the litter is then a big issue. As mentioned, the failures come around 4 to 6 weeks. Then you see Tenella coccidiosis. This is an application thing. And start production, we see the Derkx, which is a reseeding issue. If you vaccinate for coccidiosis, it is not just I give the vaccine to the birds. No, it needs a proper follow-up. And why? Because the vaccines itself, they only contain a few hundred eggs, which you vaccinate a single chicken with. And to get a proper protection, that bird needs to be dosed with thousands of eggs. Now, how do we do that? We do that by reseeding. So the bird gets the initial doses of the vaccine. The eggs reproduce themselves in the intestinal tract, are shedded out, and the bird takes manure and egg with that eggs in again, and the cycle starts again. This has to be done, that reseeding or reinfection has to be done at least 3 times. So you have to be very careful with it. Why is coccidiosis vaccine more critical, also critical? When you have an outbreak, it ends up with an enteritis. You get a bacterial gut leakage. You end up with synovitis in your rearing farm, and in production, you end up with ruptured tendons. Next of that, people like Peter and Paul don't like this because the uniformity goes down, and you have a large amount of birds with an ovary regression in the beginning of production. This is something I want to share to you. You have this in your USB stick. So how to do that proper reseeding, you can find in this leaflet used by MSD. This is something, just a joke in between. This is a picture of liver and Zika with histomonas. And this is becoming an issue in the European Union and USA. I have no idea yet how that develops itself in Africa. But here we have a lot of farms who are dealing with this issue. And there is no therapy. It's not easy to combat it, just to give you a warning. Yeah. Leg abnormalities, a big reason of culling, and not directly mortality, more culling. We see the hock infections that we discussed, your gut leakage. We see, let me get the pointer into a laser pointer. We see hock infections, including ruptured tendons. We see bumblefoot in certain areas. And we see leg damage due to injuries, injections. Injections here, I have to state that, especially in the males, when you inject those males with a too cold vaccine below 25 degrees Celsius, you will get necrosis, and these birds will get a hard breast and they will not work anymore. So just a tip on the side, injections male, be sure that your vaccine is on the right temperature. Leg damage due to injuries, then we talk about either space aggression, things like that. The metabolic leg disorders, as we discussed Wednesday in the broiler, we don't see much of that in production. Virtually nothing, not much. The reinfection, this is coming up more and more and more. The infection takes place in most of the time in rearing, but the expression we see in production. And the first thing you will find there is ruptured tendons. This video, I want to tell a little bit more about that. What you see here is a very nice flower. At least it looks like a flower. But you must realize that every dot is a real isolate, a genomic type rheo isolate. So the gene sequence is fully known of these rheos. And you see this rheo and that rheo, they are far from each other split. And the fact they don't, if I get an infection here, I don't get an infection there, protection there. So these genotypes, we call this clusters, this is genotype 4 clustering, these genotypes do not protect among each other. And the vaccine strains are located here. And the genotype, this is genotype 4, is located here. There is no protection from the vaccines as we have them now, all being genotype 1 to genotype 4. So here we are dealing, also in South Africa, we have some findings of genotype 5, and the classic vaccines will hardly protect against that. So this is a continuous issue with this rheo, and this rheo virus keeps on changing and changing and changing. It's a constant race for us to keep up with it. Actually, I think we cannot keep up. We just must stay as close as possible into that area so that we understand which subtypes are running around in a certain area. So realize genotype X does not protect against genotype X. This is that. Sorry. Staphylococci. This is an infection we see in rearing. The entrance is the intestinal tract, and especially in the restriction phase, anti-cocci outbreaks. So the restriction phase, that is for us from 6 till 16 weeks, where the amount of feed you give the birds is very limited. And the intestinal tract, that is the focus issue, gets empty every day. When the intestinal tract gets empty, you get gut leakage. Then you have entrance of staphylococci by vaccination, injections. This is not that much, but it can happen. The repair tissue, which follows after the infection, is of low quality, and they snap also in production. They break. Here is another reason why you have your ruptured tendons, why we have ruptured tendons issue. The wet litter and staphylococci, they create bumblefoot. An infection in production with staphylococci we see, but then we have skin damages during that difficult phase from 20 to 26 weeks, stress transfer, crates, water finding, feed finding, and again, wet litter. So having a good and balanced rearing is a critical thing for your lameness later on in production. Food pathology is just a picture to make that happen. And we discussed Wednesday that food path in broilers, they have a certain value. Now, this is a slide which also will be used more or less the same by the following speaker at Deal. And here, the blue line is the weight development of the bird in rearing. The yellow line is what he can grow on a rearing feed, and the red line is what he will grow on a broiler feed. So realize here that we really restrict those birds in intake, and especially from 6 till more or less 16 weeks of age. Here we have your turn-up, then the body weight nowadays goes a bit faster. In that phase, from 6 to 16, that intestinal tract suffers. And you can see that it suffers with your eyes when you see these yellow droppings, mucus droppings in your house. You have to put a full light in the rearing phase to see that. But you can see that and especially when you have a very fine feed, so maize, soya, then we have issues with it. So we have gut leakage. These bacteria enter through the intestinal wall. Feed administration and allowance in rearing are a critical phase here. So that's why we would like to have a coarse feed especially in rearing. A volume feed, the more you can feed, so the lower the energy, the better. Yeah, that's why we try 5-2 programs, and that's why we use scratch feed. So scratch feed is that in the afternoon, put some extra feed, 10 grams per day, 5 to 10 grams per day on the floor to get some feed intake in that intestinal. What you never should do, we come back to that, never decrease the increase. Keep that in mind or write it down. I'll come back to it in one of the next slides. In the European Union, there's another issue, and there's the vitamin D limitation. It's limited to 2,500 units, which is quite a critical volume for the bird. Unfortunately, we cannot go higher. I take you back here, one slide, this slide. You have to realize, so we restrict those birds from 6 to 16 so far that the vitamin suppletion is a critical phase. And if those birds have also an enteritis, they will lose vitamins, minerals, which are vital in that period. Also amino acids, so feathering, you can see that also issues. The litter quality can give you bumblefoot, hyperparathyrosis is the term. And control your external damages. Crates can be an issue, so too many birds in crates, and the injections. This I heard you talking about. Probably I'll get some questions on this one. This is what we see from time to time. And what we have found so far is the word never decrease the increase. Next slide will make that clear. So these are what you call crooked toe or curved or crooked toes. You see here a feeding program of the male. You see every week an increase, and then here the increase slows down. The increase even gets negative. They do that, of course, because the males are too heavy. Here we get negative, and then we get an increase again. In this period, while the bird is growing, you create these toes. So it should be always a plus. Maximum 1 week standing still, preferably not, but it should be always per week an increase in feed intake. It's not easy, I know that. If you look at the manuals, you also will see there that there's almost never a stop. It's always a slow increase because the weight of the bird increases, so the volume increases. So we need also more maintenance. This is a CT scan, one of our birds, and on the blue arrows, you see the follicles. There's nothing wrong with these birds here. There's a follicle here, there's a follicle here, follicle here, follicle here. Here, this is the cut of the proventriculus, as Dr. Clark has shown us. This is the keel bone, so the bird is lying on its belly. Why do I show you this now? We simply go to the next subject, being egg peritonitis. We have something to keep in mind when we have those birds coming from rearing to production. And that is that we're going to stimulate those birds from 8 hours most of the time to 11, 10, 12 hours. This is okay. And the light goes into the eye, but also into the skull. A bird has an epiphyse and a hypophyse, and the epiphyse receives those waves and stimulates the onset of production of hormones. So all wavelengths reach the eye, but only the red wavelengths, so the longer wavelengths, can penetrate the skull and reach the pineal gland. Why is that important? In rearing, there's 8 hours light, and you have a high melatonin release. So that means the sleeping hormone. The melatonin is actually responsible for your day-night rhythm. And about half an hour before you sleep, the peak is on its highest. But melatonin indirectly inhibits the gonad development. So in this phase, with 8 hours of flight, with high melatonin, relatively high melatonin levels, the production of hormones is blocked indirectly. Yeah? When you move from 8 to 11 hours flight, you get a decrease from the production of melatonin. And then you get a trigger stimulation of the hypothalamus and the hypophysis. And then the next step of the bird is that you get a growth of ovary, oviduct, and liver. That is how it works. But what you need for that, going back to the previous slide, you will need that light, red light getting into the skull. That is why you see that COP recommends certain wavelengths as white light. White is a composition of all colors, but there's variation. If you look to your ceiling and you have a very hard bluish white light, there's not much red in that. If you have a soft light, a soft white, a soft tone most of the time called, then you have light with sufficient a fraction of red in it, which is responsible for the stimulation. So this is something also to keep in mind. And nowadays, yeah, with the LCD lighting, you have to be extra careful because these lightings, which produce this hard white light, they are cheaper than the one who produce the red waves. So a sales department or department which takes care of buying products easily is prone to buy the blue light instead of the warm light. But that is not what we should do. So keep that in mind with this LED lighting systems. Now the reproductive system, we talked about that yesterday. Here you have the clutch of eggs. There is something I want to say here regarding to Mark Foot. Mark Foot this morning, he did speak about how long can we have a good hatch from an egg. And then you see a decline from 7 days onwards. This is a natural process. A hen normally lays 7 eggs, sometimes 8, sometimes 6, but average 7 eggs, has a clutch in her nest, and then her brooding period starts. Yeah. So the quality of those 7 eggs is more or less equal for those 7 days, because it takes her 7 days to produce that egg. So what Mark is showing you, 7 days stable, then going down, is a normal physiological process. This, Dr. Clark talked about, this is not, the rest is not that important at this moment. But this, I showed you this on Wednesday also, the fimbriae, the funnel, this is the risky thing, because in this period where that follicle is absorbed by the fimbriae, by the infundibulum, yeah, that is the moment when there is a lot of stress on the bird. This egg will not be gripped, will not be taken by the fimbriae and end up in the infundibulum, but like here it is a normal process. But it will end in the abdominal cavity and give an infection there. This is what we call an egg peritonitis. Not all eggs who end up in the abdominal cavity, follicles who end up in the abdominal cavity, will give an infection, but some will. Keep that in mind. So this is a really critical phase. And this process takes most of the time place in the beginning of the day when the light goes on. This is the normal range. Yes, as mentioned, this is just a picture to show you. We have here from 1 centimeter till a full follicle, 6 to 7 in this case. We don't count the egg. The egg peritonitis. It is a bit less nowadays. You know, I think there is more focus on management, but a few years ago, this was the one of the major killers, infectious killers of hens. There is also something which is called the classic peritonitis. This is not very common in breeders, but it is a common finding in layers. Just for you to know, there's a difference in here. In principle, for the classic peritonitis, you don't need a follicle. This is most flock agitation, rooster kill. Port of entrance here can be air, gut, cloaca, skin. Port of entrance here is gut and oviduct. What do you see? You see this kind of follicles, ovaries showing up. Yeah, you see the regression. You see a septicemia. You see multiple ovulations, and sometimes we find also a white cooked breast. That is a sepsis picture. This is also something we see. So here we have two follicles almost on the same spot in the oviduct. Causes of this peritonitis. Of course, you can overstimulation, age versus weight. So the melatonin release or stop is too early to get this kind of pictures. Heat stress is a known one. Stress itself, feed, water, ventilation, feed the space, water, the amount of points they have to drink, ventilation, and the aggression of males. Aggression of females is not that common, but surely females itself can be a role. And then we talk about this factor here, feeder space. Where the feeder space is limited, when you have less than 15 centimeters, we will find it. If possible, correct your causes. Think about your percentage male. Photostimulation based on flashing. From a veterinary point, photostimulation is never too late and often too early. Also use the right source of light. So as mentioned, this 2007 to 3000 Kelvin white light, which is giving a good red color. I just had to look for a question. Sorry. Antibiotics, acids, etc. are used. They have a temporary effect, something like 10, 14 days, and then it comes back. Vaccines are used. We have the emulsion-killed commercial vaccines. We have the auto vaccines, so that is where you take E. coli from a dead bird, from the peritoneum, and make a vaccine out of it. And we have nowadays the sprayed live vaccine. I would say a lot of these vaccines are used a lot. Sudden death, not such a nice picture, but what you see here is a very red follicles. You see the breaking line where they snap out of the membrane. You see them quite clearly here. This is quite an issue nowadays. Here you see it again, a bit better. These are too red. These are simply too red. Yeah. It's an acute lack of phosphorus or potassium or potassium. You see it with rapid growth of immature underflesh bird after photostimulation. Before photostimulation, you will not find it. The available phosphorus potassium for that bird at a given moment is too low, and then the heart simply fails. You get acute mortality. You don't see any sick birds. You see it mainly on young flocks, onset of production. Overflashing increased. What you see is on the birds is overflashing. So often smaller bird with a big breast, increased blood circulation on the ovaries. You see an enlarged decompensated heart. You see an acute diarrhea. And you see congestion, bottles, combs, and internal organs. This is the pathway to it. You start with immature underflesh pullets, and you end up with cardiac arrest. So here, there's where our tricky thing is. The rearing is, I would say, a very, in the modern breeder, a very, very important. What to do if you have this? So when it's the case, okay, look for your phosphorus level, and you can use potassium carbonate in the feed or in the water, most used in the feed. There's also potassium chlorine used, but then, of course, you have a higher risk on wet litter. The prevention, of course, is in the management, proper flashing, and balanced stimulation. Tetany. Tetany is a disease which you see in more species. Your dog can have it, the female dog. Your cow can have it. Your chicken can have it. We also see it in pigs. It is an acute lack of calcium. And this is the picture what you see. The follicles are normal, no over, not too red or nothing. No, they are quite normal. And you always find an almost finished egg in the uterus. The birds don't have the calcium power anymore to put that egg outside through the cloaca. So low calcium during eggshell formation with acute heart failure. You see a poor body condition in most birds. Heat stress here again is a factor, so there is a seasonal influence. There can be a decrease in calcium intake if they cannot take enough feed, if they drink a lot, and then you get a fast gastrointestinal passage with less calcium. The birds are panting. Mainly on young flocks, only hens. It's a morning mortality. In young flocks, we see it in the morning. So when your people start in the house, you will find the birds dead. They tremble, shake, paralyzes. Not many lesions on post-mortem. The ovary looks fine, and you have that egg in the oviduct. Prevention. This is, of course, more the field for the next speaker, but I will give a shot for him. Low calcium diets, slow release calcium sources. And the most calcium, realize it is needed 16 to 20 hours after feed intake, because then the eggshell is formed. Yeah. So in the morning, he doesn't need that much, but in the afternoon and the night, he needs a lot of calcium to get that shell formed. Limestone is added, oyster shells is added, vitamin D is used, and of course the management. Not all birds get it, so there is a management factor involved. Fatty liver syndrome, I will not go too long about that. I think I have to look at my clock. I'm a little bit overhead, sorry for that, go a bit faster. Fatty liver syndrome, we don't see that much anymore. The nutritionists really are good in balancing this out. Yeah. So we see these big livers and bleedings on the livers, bleedings in the abdominal cavity. It's an overweight at moment of photostimulation, an excess of feed before egg production. No feed withdrawal post-peak, and the feed composition. You can do something in the feed composition. You can decrease the carbohydrate composition, and you can be sure that you have sufficient lipotropes and phospholipids in the feed. Choline, betaine, methionine, glycine. Choline is the most used. So the mortality heavy birds, they have often white combs, so they're pale. After 35 weeks, hemorrhages in the liver, soft and yellow livers, and they have an excessive fat. The excessive fat, 9 out of 10 times, is coming from those carbohydrates, which are easily converted into belly fat. So what you should do, check your feed allowance, check your metabolic energy in your feed. Here are the standards which Edward is using. Be sure you have choline biotin in there. Pullet weight development. Slow down feed increases to the peak, so not too rapidly, please. lower energy is an option in the feed, not always, but can help. And evaluate your carbohydrate and fat composition in your feed. The message I want to give to you, and mortality, it is mainly at onset and end of production. The majority is management water feed light related. Of the infectious group, E. coli as a sepsis, peritonitis is the biggest group. The solutions start in rearing with a good uniformity and a good body weight development and proper vaccination, especially the coccidiosis is something which you have to keep in mind. Thank you for your attention, ladies and gentlemen. Any questions?